My topic is tasty fasting, so some contrast, some conflict between religion and cuisine and art of cuisine, especially strong in Poland in early modern time when the Catholicism was especially underlined and emphasized by especially upper strata of society, and it was expressed among all by the cuisine, by the rules of classified people according to the kind of food they ate. I would like also to link the subject with the use of history, the use of old recipes, old culinary texts nowadays as a kind of inspiration, as a kind of documentation, and also as a kind of tool for gastronomic schools or for broader food education. I will try to focus on three main subjects. So first of all, as a point of depart, fasting and dietetics. So the rule of Christian fasting, Christian Lents, and the link with the old dietetics. We suppose nowadays that diet is modern invention. The historians of food know very well that it's something actually eternal, that each civilization has its own dietetics, however, really different from our, not only from our dietary rules, but from our dietetics idea. Then I will move a little to the main subject of our conference, freshwater fish, and will present some recipes as historical documents, trying to criticize a little the text, but also to emphasize the possible use, possible reading, possible interpretations, and at the end, the use of history for different broader goals. I will try with the idea of dietetics, of old dietetics. It's quite well known, discussed several times by historians of food for ancient times, medieval times, and especially Renaissance. It's nothing new for historians of food, but the link between both, between old, ancient humoral dietetics and Christian rules of fasting are not so obvious. I hope you have heard about this humoral dietetics, so the system of 4 humors, of 4 liquids, regulating not only the health of each individual, but also his so-called complexion, so his psychological attitude. So there are 4 main elements like fire, earth, and water and air. It's an ancient discovery already in ancient Greece. And they, not only by its character, for example, fire is warm, is supposed to be warm and dry, water is supposed to be moist and cold. By its character, it influences each individual, not only by biology, but also in psychological sense. So, for example, here you can see that there are 4 main complexions. We got 4 main type of complexion, so sanguine, choleric, melancholic, phlegmatic. The main idea is that you have to balance the complexion. For example, choleric, which is supposed to have too much fire, too much yellow bile, so hot nature, he must adopt a strict dietary rules, consuming mostly, for example, fish, because fish were supposed to be moist and cold. And I would like just underline that this old ancient idea simply jak to się robi z tym pokażem? Otwórz, nie, wiesz? Przygotuj pokaz, nie? Na F5 robię, to mi zamyka wtedy. that, for example, so choleric must temperate his complexion by eating so cold and, if possible, moist food, and especially fish and other water creatures were supposed as healthy for this type of people. And actually, on this idea of choleric, someone easily angered, someone violent, is built the idea that fasting, the idea of fasting, simply the fathers of church adopted the common ancient notion of dietetics to about in 3rd and 4th century after Christ. There is quite nice explanation from late medieval manual of dietetics, very simple, linking especially the complexion with sexual behavior. So we can understand how important it was for the church and its moral teaching. So phlegmatic was perhaps the most positive complexion from the point of view of the church, but from the point of view of medicine, sanguine type was the most healthy, most balanced. Anyway, the cholericus was as the most violent, was the most dangerous, however melancholic. From the it would be a kind of depression, rather, something what we define as depression, was as a kind of asceticism. Asceticism was really largely accepted by the church, but criticized as by the medicines, by doctors. So fasting is quite understandable for us. So it's the restrictions of meat, but accepting different water creatures, not fishes simply, but water creatures, because all water creatures were believed to have this cold value, the cold humoral value. So also dairy products were prohibited because they came from the from animals, from hot creatures. So in medieval times and in early modern times, European and especially, I think, Polish during Counterreform and Orthodox culinary system was based very strongly on these religious ideas, and some of them represented a big problems for nations and countries in eastern and northern part of Europe, because actually fasting restrictions came not only from this dietetics, but also were a reflection of Mediterranean diet, of Mediterranean geography. So some products like wine, like olive oil or seaside fish were quite rare or really expensive in northern part of Europe. Alcohol beverages occupied completely different place, and especially new exotic food provoked many problems for people, especially sugar, for example, whether it was accepted or not, or something much more difficult. Why fathers of church didn't heard about sugar. An example from the oldest culinary book from our region, from 15th century, so-called Teutonic cookbook, written in Old German, so it's not quite Polish, but our regional one, late 15th century. A very nice idea how to eat sausage during Lent. Actually, it's not possible for Teutonic knights. They were monks, they were religious. But there is a very popular in medieval times idea of culinary illusion. You may prepare a kind of sausage, it's a shape of sausage, a kind of dessert from figs, from gingerbread, from sugar, and it have a kind of taste of the true medieval sausage. So it's sweet and spicy. And it concerns the gingerbread, which is the crucial point here for our Hanseatic region. It's not just a cake, but omnipresent spice or omnipresent element of old cookery. Another idea, not only a culinary illusion, is just to use many fresh water fish. In the first Polish cookbook, Compendium Folklorium from late 17th century that we translated into English, so I can use English quotations, there are one third of the containing is represent the recipes on the fish, mostly freshwater fishes. The most popular is pike, but it will be another paper strictly on this fashion of Polish pike, but also salmon, sturgeon, trout, loach, of course carp, which was very popular here. All fat fishes were popular. Freshwater fish were so popular because we had actually very narrow access to the sea. You can see that only it's in the area of Gdańsk, a very narrow access to the Baltic Sea, and the problems of transportation. Actually, the popularity of fresh maritime fish, it's linked with the French cookery in second half of 17th century, when the big group of consumers in Versailles and Paris may pay very, very expensive transportation from the seaside. So this cookbook of Teutonic Knights, it's really concerned with the problem of fasting, and it was a kind of transportation of Western medieval culinary tradition in the Baltic Sea. You can see a whole empire of this tradition, which is actually nowadays used in the castle of Malbork. There is a special historic restaurant led by, I am very proud of him, my doctorand, Mr. Bogdan Gałązka, who works on these old recipes. Of course, didn't try to reconstruct them literally, but propose a kind of reinterpretation of this. It's very nice link between the place, the history, and the time. So visiting the restaurant there is a kind of visit of castle, of visit of the museum. A very nice idea, very, very, very old. I think I borrow a little subject from Mr. Cios, but hope that he don't know perhaps this recipe. It's not this Jewish or Jewish fish, but something that demonstrates us that this very long tradition of adding hot spices for both taste and this dietetics idea of balancing different humors was in the source of very old and still quite popular tradition of Jewish fish, still popular in Polish cuisine nowadays, especially for the Christmas Eve time. So it's pike stuffed with another fish with the meat of the pike, but with a little sweet and hot spices. Another idea here is taken from Compendium Folklorium. It's boneless carp. It's also something what reminds me the idea of gefilte fish, so popular not only in Poland, but for example in New York. It's something international due to popularity of Jewish cuisine or Jewish diaspora. It's quite popular, and I think it's a kind of rule that this kind of old, archaic, forgotten recipes were a very long time practiced not by Poles, not by Catholics, not by aristocrats, but by very small isolated group. If we could find nowadays Polish cuisine, some examples from this book, there are only a very small group of Tartars in the eastern Poland, and this Jewish tradition of mixture of hot spices and sugar and sweetening. So another idea here is to a kind of gefilte fish, however, there are different kinds, and this is not classical one really, is adding the gingerbread, so something very particular for us here. We try nowadays to reintroduce a gingerbread, so main local product. We have got 2 museums, many producers, to everything. We try to recreate this idea to cook with gingerbread as a kind of tourist attraction, as a kind of distinctive trait of local Toruń and historical cuisine addressed to tourists. So once again, carp with honey cake, which means actually gingerbread once again. The carp was so popular in Polish cuisine due to religious restrictions, because it was perhaps the fattest fish, quite easily accessible locally. But for example, the French Revolution, so carp in a very, very specific moment of French Revolution appears as an enemy of modernity, as an enemy of revolution, because carp is something related to the church. Church is related to aristocracy and to the absolutism. So there is very nice idea. There is quite good French study of conjuration contre les carpes, so the kind of revolution against carp. In the Polish fashion on the freshwater fish, we can find something international. We can find a example of fashion, international fashion, which will be developed by Marta. I just would like to demonstrate to you that this long archaic specialization of Polish cuisine in fasting dishes was really in some time fashionable in France, in Europe. Écrevisse, so crayfish, for example. Many recipes of écrevisse, so sweetwater crayfish, which are very rare nowadays. The noble crayfish is actually under strict protection. We got very nice example from famous French cookery book from 19th century cuisine classique, when the perhaps most famous Polish recipe, carp à la polonaise, so carp with gingerbread, spiced carp, was presented as something typical for Poland, because Polonais servent se relever la veille de Noël, because it's something typical for the Christmas Eve time. How we can use this kind of history, accepting the academic history itself? I think it may be a kind of documentation, especially in case of geographical indication and traditional specialties. History of cookery, I think, is much more important in Poland than in France, because due to the communism, due to some very big crisis of the Polish gastronomy, a big part of Polish culinary tradition is really forgotten. So some cooks, some really very modern cooks use quite often, some narrow group of very modern, fashionable cooks use very, very often this archaic model of cuisine to present it as something very modern, as something new. So it's rather inspiration. We got some cooks here, for example, Mr. Poznański, who worked exactly on these recipes from the 20th century, and we have discussed very many times the problems of reconstruction of inspiration. I was always rather for strict reconstruction, but it's not possible. Actually, it's a kind of nonsense. But It's rather an inspiration, it's rather a story that cooks use the history, because the history occupies a very specific place in Polish food movement. Because the popularity of the new gastronomy is something quite new in Poland. The specific place of cooks and culinary fashions is something relating to, I don't know, 10 or perhaps 15 last years. So we haven't developed in Poland the true food studies, anthropology, sociology, or really very deep humanist interest in the food culture. So the history is traditionally used as a kind of ideology, like in politics. So if cooks may just feel that they work on their recipes are old, it means the same that they are serious. We got a very serious, so cooks start to occupy very particular place in Polish culture, a little like in France. It's normal, it's usual in France. In Poland, it's something new. So they try to justify the new economic status and their social role by history. They very often combine these old influences with very modern cuisine in this movement of neo-archaism. But I would rather emphasize that studying history here, studying different food choices, different recipes, different tastes, different food ideologies like religious one or dietetic one, we rather try to better understand the present times that use strictly the history. However, it's used by many people in different ways. We will try to develop the problem tomorrow during our seminar on food in museums. We will try to develop it today afternoon during our big culinary presentation at 5 o'clock. I wish just to develop a little the subject of Mr. Makowiecki by chronologic continuation and just to trying to prove that our work may be used by cooks and broader public. Thank you very much.